I'm Clint Gilchrist. I'm director of the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming. Today we're at the Fort Bonneville State Historic Site. Fort Bonneville was built here in 1832 by Captain Benjamin Bonneville. It was the first structure built in what is now Wyoming. None of that structure is left, but the site is still here. Benjamin Bonneville, he was a military man, but he took leave of absence from the military to come out and be part of the fur trade business out here. He came out in 1832 and spent 3 years going throughout the whole West. There is some speculation that he might have been doing some covert reconnaissance for the military, but today I want to talk about the trip he had and his fort. One of the most important things about Bonneville is he brought 20 wagons with him, and he brought the wagons over South Pass to get to this point. Those are the first wagons to come over South Pass. He brought 20 wagons with him. And they really were a challenge for him, but William Sublette 2 years earlier had brought wagons with the Rendezvous Supply Caravan over onto the Wind River, so they didn't go over South Pass. He never brought wagons again, William Sublette didn't, so that tells us that wagons were a little difficult to deal with in this mountainous country. They were okay out in the plains of eastern Wyoming and Nebraska and Kansas, but not here in the mountains. But Bonneville brought his 20 wagons. Before they even got over South Pass, he started having trouble with the wheels. The wood was shrinking in the wheels, probably because of the dryness of the atmosphere and maybe something to do with altitude. But the wheels were starting to fall apart. And so he actually had to take the metal tires off, nail a new band of wood around each of the wheels and heat up the tires and put them back on to secure it. So just to get here, he had problems. And that was a very common experience with immigrants later, several decades later when they came out. But he did get the wagons to this location. In August of 1832, he built this fort here. During the rendezvous that was held here, Warren Ferris came through here and he described that fort. He described it as a square enclosure with about 1 foot in diameter log pickets along all of the walls, about 15 feet high, and then 2 blockhouses on 2 opposing corners of the fort. So it must have looked very much like a traditional fort. But in 1832, Bonneville builds this fort, and the mountain men tell him that he's crazy to winter here because nobody winters here. The Indians didn't winter here, the mountain men didn't winter here, there's just too much snow. So they told him he was crazy, and Ferris even remarks that they called this Fort Nonsense for that very reason. And so he pretty much left the fort within a month of building it and went up and wintered on the Salmon River. And even though he did come back to the fort a couple times, he never really used it after that. So when Bonneville left the fort in 1832, when he went going to the Salmon River, he had all these wagons and goods with him, so he decided to cache all of them. And according to Washington Irving, who was the biographer, or the one who wrote the story of his Western adventures, he said that he buried the wagons. So we don't know if the wagons were really buried here or not. It seems pretty dramatic to say that you would bury 20 wagons, but maybe they did. One thing that's very interesting though, in 1927, the local homesteader who was here, Dr. Montrose, he homesteaded this area and he knew this fort location. And his neighbor, Bill Enos, was digging a ditch. And 3 to 4 foot down, he found a metal tire, a metal rim off of a wagon wheel. And it was deep in the ground and it was still in really good shape. So it was like it was buried when it was fairly new. And so they were all fascinated. They got hold of Grace Hebert she was a state historian, but she said, yes, we'd love to have that. They offered to send it to her and we'd love to have that. We have those letters of that exchange. But let's get back to this site specifically. So Fort Bonneville, because Washington Irving, one of the most famous writers of the time, had written about Captain Bonneville's adventures, this fort was well known about. And the homesteaders that settled here in the early 1900s figured out about where the location was. That was still many years after, but in 1915, Grace Hebert and H.G. Nickerson worked with the local landowner, Dr. Montrose, and they actually marked the site. There's a stone monument right here just out of view that, that they put up in 1915 for the site. Since then, this sign has been put up in 1989. There was an archaeological investigation out here that recovered quite a bit of material about the fort. It kind of uncovered the footprint of the fort. That's where we learned that it's probably about 80 foot by 80 foot square. There was a lot of blacksmithing activity, a lot of slag, and so it was clear there was some kind of blacksmithing activity going on here. So we learned about the size of the fort from the archaeological investigations, and we learned a little bit about the use of the fort. A few years ago, in 1929, Dr. Montrose donated 1 acre to the State Landmarks Commission. It's now part of state parks, and so this is a state park, Wyoming State Park, 1 acre here. And just last year, the Suffolk County Historical Society, a local nonprofit who runs the Museum of the Mountain Man, signed an agreement with the state to be co-managers of this site. And so it seemed like a really good deal to work together with the state. And so now this is managed jointly by the Museum of the Mountain Man and by Wyoming State Parks. The Fort Bonneville site is located about 11 miles west of Pinedale. Stop at the Museum of the Mountain Man and they can give you directions on where to find it.